On this Thanksgiving, it's appropriate we talk about food and other things that we take in our bodies, and we want to welcome Michael Fumento, who is the author of Bioevolution, How Biotechnology is Changing Our World. Good morning. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Thank you.
What's the message from this book?
The message is that biotechnology is the most exciting science going out there. That's why I chose to write about this topic. And that in the next few years, or shall we say right now, it's going to change absolutely everything in our lives.
What is biotechnology?
Everybody has their own definition. I don't have a monopoly on that. But the one I use is either the selective use of a gene or genes, or doing something to, in some way, again, specifically and intentionally interact with the genome.
Quote, biotechnology won't bring utopia. There will be no dawning of the age of Aquarius. Biotechnology won't stop all pain, physical or psychological. It won't be the answer to every medical problem we know today, and it will have to deal with some we don't know about yet. It can eventually solve all the world's food problems, but it won't solve all the environmental problems. Healthy lifespans will be extended dramatically, but if it's immortality you seek, then seek elsewhere. What biotechnology does offer is a tool that can make the planet unimaginably better than it is now. That's a tall order.
Yes, and yet you see in there that I'm not promising pie in the sky. I am actually by nature something of a pessimist, and definitely by nature a skeptic. I have made my reputation as a skeptic. So when I say that the miracles in this book, and this book is filled with what could be called miracles, are going to come to fruition, and more than that, most of them will come to fruition in the next 5 to 10 years, then coming from a skeptic such as myself, you'd better believe it. It's going to happen.
Okay, let's take two things. First of all, food. How can it solve the world's food problems?
Well, we had something called the Green Revolution, which was absolutely terrific. We had people like Paul Ehrlich saying that millions and millions of people would starve to death because the population would outstrip the food supply. Because of the Green Revolution, the food supply has continued to provide more and more calories per person throughout the world, not just in the United States, where it's very obvious. But the Green Revolution, unfortunately, also had to rely on things like far more fertilizer, far more chemicals of all sorts, far more irrigation, which causes problems, and there's only so much water to irrigate with. Biotech will take care of all of that. We'll need less irrigation. We'll need less water to grow these crops. We'll be able to grow crops in salty water. We'll be able to grow crops with far fewer inputs, such as fertilizers and pesticides. And we'll simply be able to grow more crops in less area, period, through, again, taking maybe a single gene or a few genes and taking them out of one organism and putting them into another. Perhaps 4 times as many crops per acre as we can now.
Our phone lines are open. We welcome your comments. You can also send us an email at journal@cspan.org. Our guest is Michael Fumento, who's out with his new book on biotechnology, the other aspect dealing with medicine. And you say that in the 1990s, 13% of all new medicines came from biotechnology.
Right, and more important, the trend line is going up. We will eventually get to a point, again, before too long, where all medicine is in some way biotechnology related.
A few examples.
There was a great example just a couple of weeks ago in the news about so-called Drano for the arteries. Now this is truly a miracle drug. They found that just 5 injections of a protein cleared out 4% of the plaque in the participants' arteries, 4% of the plaque. And moreover, there's no reason to think that with more injections they couldn't clear out more. But 4% is incredible. It would take a statin drug 18 months to accomplish the same thing. In short, this drug could lead, because it can prevent atherosclerosis, which is one of the biggest killers in the United States, and heart disease is the biggest killer. This drug could save literally hundreds of thousands of American lives alone each year. And this drug is biotech. It was discovered 25 years ago in northern Italian men that they had a special protein that gave them a certain type of cholesterol that greatly lowered their risk of heart disease. Well, 25 years ago, it was a nice discovery, but they couldn't do anything with it. But then biotech came along, gene splicing specifically came along, and they were able to take this protein and splice it into bacteria and grow as much as they wanted. That's the future of medicine.
For somebody who may have just tuned in, maybe watching the turkey tips on the other morning programs, why should they care about this? Why is it important?
It's important in any way you can think of. It's important in terms of, for example, human health. Again, when you think of one biotech drug helping to prevent hundreds of thousands of premature deaths per year in the United States alone, when you think of just a few different types of biotech plants that are already well underway as far as being developed, that will save tens of millions of lives, maybe hundreds of millions, by preventing malnutrition and blindness and what have you through the world. When you think of something called bioremediation, which means the use of microorganisms or plants or what have you to clean up toxic waste dumps in an environmentally friendly and cheap way. When you look at just those few areas of biotech, again, you see how this is going to cause absolutely dramatic, drastic, and very good changes for the world.
Some background on our guest, Michael Fumento, who's the author of this book, Bioevolution, How Biotechnology is Changing Our World. He began his career working for Congressman Dan Crane back in the 1980s. He's a graduate of the University of North Carolina, where he earned his undergraduate degree, and then on to the University of Illinois. Served in the U.S. Army, is a former fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. Used to write for the Washington Times and also for the Rocky Mountain News. And our first call is from Philadelphia. Good morning.
Good morning. I had a question as to how you felt about stem cell research, as to whether or not you felt this fell into this area. And my comments before you comment on it would be, if certain people in the government are so pro-life, then why are they against stem cell research whenever it could prolong people's lives, in essence being pro-life through medical advances and advances in farming to feed the starving people around the world?
Thank you, caller.
Unfortunately, there's a lot of mythology concerning stem cell research, and the first thing you need to understand is there are two completely different paths, two completely different types of stem cells. You are talking about what are called embryonic stem cells, and these are made by growing human embryos and literally ripping them apart in order to get the stem cells from them. People have ethical problems with that because whether or not you believe that this is a very early abortion, as some people do, there's no doubt that an embryo is human life. It's not a chicken, it's not a monkey. It's a human, it is human. So people have ethical problems with that, and we all need to be concerned with other people's ethical problems, whether we believe that or not. The other problem is embryonic research does in fact lead to cloning research. There's no getting around it. It's the very first step towards human cloning. You can stop at some point if you wish, but the research will lead in that direction. That's why people have problems with embryonic stem cell research. But there's something called adult stem cells. Now, these have already been used therapeutically since the 1980s. If you've ever heard of a bone marrow transplant or an umbilical cord transplant, what they're really transplanting are the stem cells. So this has already been used in humans. The embryonic stuff is only now getting into rodent studies. The adult stem cells, furthermore, they're finding more and more uses for these things, such that while it used to be believed that only embryonic cells potentially could become every type of tissue in the human body, whereas stem cells were more limited. They could become lots of types, but they were more limited. It's now being found that stem cells are found throughout the body, so that even if they are limited somewhat in what they can become, if they're found throughout the body, maybe we don't need one size fits all. Moreover, 3 different sets of researchers have found that perhaps a single type of stem cell, adult stem cell, mind you, can in fact become all types of cells in the body. So I argue in my book, we don't need the embryonics and we don't need all that ethical baggage that comes with the embryonics. The adult stem cells will work.
Other books by our guest, Michael Fumento, include Science Under Siege, the myth of heterosexual AIDS, and also the fat of the land, the obesity epidemic, and how overweight Americans can help themselves. Albuquerque, New Mexico, next for our guest. Good morning.
Good morning. Happy Thanksgiving.
And to you too.
Hey, I'd like your guest there to also mention the fact that a lot of countries, a lot of people in the world refuse to eat our biotech stuff. You know, just because you can do something doesn't necessarily mean you should. You know, we're getting so arrogant that we think we can recreate things that God has created. That's pretty foolish, I think.
Thanks for the comment. Greenbelt, Maryland, you're next.
Yes, I'm very disturbed by your guest's columns on the so-called safety of silicone implants. I left him messages on the Nazi origin of silicone implants, and he never called me back. Silicone is tied back to Nazi scientist Otto Ambros, who served 3 years for manufacturing the Zyklon B gas used on Jews. Well, he also is the father of liquid silicone, and he was recruited while in jail by Dow Chemical to work on plastics and chemicals.
Your response?
Really, I'd rather stick to biotechnology, but the fact is this lady is completely wrong. Silicone implants were invented by Americans. They were first used in the United States in the 1960s. They have absolutely nothing to do with the Nazis. This is an urban legend.
Page 125 of your book. Old people are living to be somewhat older due to a host of factors, especially better health care for seniors and better nutrition. Still, none of this affects what's called the natural human lifespan. That is, more and more of us are getting closer to the maximum, and more importantly, we're getting there in better shape. Yet we're repeatedly told that our natural lifespan or outside limit of longevity for humans is fixed at about 120 years, or is it?
It's not. I just spoke of one urban legend. Another urban legend is that people can only live to be about 120, and then there's something built into us that makes us drop over dead. That I quote a doctor in there saying that this is just pulled out of thin air, based on the fact that very few people in the world have, in fact, lived past 120. Moreover, biotech could break through, even if this were a natural barrier, biotech could and will break through this. Already, by my count, there are 8 biotech gene therapies alone that could do so. Now, by that I mean simply basically flipping on a gene, flipping off a gene, or maybe adding in more genes. That these have already been shown in rodent experiments and lower life forms that age in very much the same way that humans do, and they've made these creatures live to be 30% longer, 50% longer, to live even longer than that. So if the average American now is dying, the average 40-year-old can expect about 40 more years. Now they can really, many of the people watching the show, I'm telling you right now, are going to live well past 120, in fact, well past 150. And most importantly, the period before they become decrepit, before they have to be in a wheelchair or in a nursing home or what have you, will likewise be extended well into maybe 140, 150 years, or even more.
Columbus, Ohio, good morning.
Hello, thank you for C-SPAN. First of all, I'd like to recommend Matt Ridley's book, Nature versus Nurture, to anybody who's wanting to familiarize themselves with DNA, genetics. But I wanted to ask Mr. Finetta about, I'm reading a book right now by Edwin Black, War Against the Weak. It's about eugenics, and in it he says that we should be worrying about the patenting of genes. That's almost on the same line of thought as what caused the horror of eugenics.
Thank you.
You have to understand that throughout history, people have been trying to improve everything about them. whether it's their livestock, whether it's their crops. An earlier caller talked about how this is playing God. I think was, the expression always pops up by trying to alter the things around us. Well, the fact is, for example, with crops and with animals, we've been altering their genomes for 5,000 years now through traditional crossbreeding. Biotech is simply an improvement upon that. Well, with eugenics, it's only natural that people are going to want their children to be somewhat smarter, that they're going to want them to be improved in any way. And guess what? They're already doing it. But right now, it tends to favor rich people because they can put their kids to the best high schools, private schools, colleges. If, in fact, we ever use gene splicing, gene therapy to make our kids, say, smarter, this will hardly be anything new. And more than that, the worst thing about eugenics was not the idea of simply trying to improve the human race. The excesses of eugenics, as we saw in the Nazi era, was sterilizing and killing off the weak, the so-called inferior. If we ever see any kind of eugenics with biotech, it would not involve killing off or sterilizing anybody.
Our guest is Michael Frumento. Our topic, biotechnology, the book Bioevolution, How Biotechnology is Changing Our World. Indianapolis, good morning.
Yes, thanks for the opportunity for calling in. I think we've kind of gotten off track. I just wanted to get back to the environmental implications of altering crops and different types of aspects of how the human body reacts to those changes as well. When we change a crop from its original lifespan and or original intention in nature, because I believe nature has cycles, and sometimes crops aren't meant to go beyond an extended period of time. I understand with a food and health crisis, trying to feed those who can't and aren't possible and aren't able to grow crops in a region where they may have been struck by a natural disaster. But at some point in time, nature has a way of balancing it out. And when we start messing with the balance, do you think there's some implications in the future that may cause us to have some unforeseen problems that we hadn't really thought of just because of a simple tampering with the lifespan of a crop? And that's my question.
Thank you, caller.
It's important to keep in mind that virtually nothing we eat now that does not have the word wild in it is as it originally was. So, okay, let's grant that Ewell Gibbons's wild hickory nuts were always that way. But on the other hand, now today's Thanksgiving. What about turkeys? If you've ever seen a live turkey as bred in a farm versus a wild turkey, you know there is an incredible difference. Everything else we eat, let's say we have corn today for Thanksgiving. There is no such thing as wild corn. Corn was invented 5,000 years ago by Mexican Americans by combining several types of wild grasses. Now that gave them a corn that looks a very tiny ear, such as you might get, say, in Chinese food. Then in the 1920s and 1930s, American scientists developed this corn even more to give us the nice, large, sweet ears that we have today. Tomatoes used to be about the size of golf balls and about the same color as golf balls as well. Everything we eat pretty much has already been genetically modified. The difference is biotech allows it to be done scientifically, quickly, and with the oversight of the FDA, the USDA, and the EPA.
And just this side note from today's New York Times, this is a poultry distributor in Harlem, New York, and carrying on a tradition that began 80 years ago, providing live turkeys, fresh, guaranteed, for Thanksgiving. Next call is from Page Springs, Arizona. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you for taking my call. I'm a little nervous this morning. I've noticed that in watching the cloning history, that of Dolly, etc., that if I'm not mistaken, it takes the use of the uterus to to make the cloning happen. And I've also noticed that it's always the men that seem to have the biggest problem with the cloning. And is it true women can clone women and there would be no more use of procreation in our normal form if women could do this? And is that why men are so afraid of it?
Thank you, caller.
It is true. There is a method of cloning. Obviously, it's not in use yet. It's a potential method. It's called parthenogenesis. And you could theoretically create women from women. They would be identical copies of their mothers. This is something that I don't think is a particularly good thing. And I think that women as well as men share my concern. I don't think this is a male concern.
We'll leave it at that. From page 251, getting more vitamins into foods we enjoy, a major goal of biotech engineers. As it happens, those who pop vitamin supplements also are those likely to eat well, while unfortunately non-poppers tend to eat more junk. And in essence, what you say in this chapter on foods that taste too good to be healthy is the influence of vitamins in products like milk, other dairy items that normally would not be there, and the difference between what we have in this country with vitamin D installed or being incorporated into the milk versus those in third world nations that drink it straight from the cow.
Exactly so. All countries have or had at one point vitamin deficiencies. In the United States, we had vitamin D deficiencies, we had iodine deficiencies, we had folic acid deficiencies. So what did we do? Well, we added vitamin D to milk, we've added folic acid to bread quite recently, and we've added iodine to salt. Now, in an industrialized country like the US, you can do that, and you can do that cheaply. But there are terrible, far worse vitamin deficiencies in underdeveloped countries. For example, vitamin A, iron, and zinc are the big three, really. Because of the lack of vitamin C, or vitamin A in rice, which is a staple crop throughout much of the world, a couple of million people die every year. It is the leading cause of childhood blindness, the fact that there's no vitamin A in rice. Biotech is changing that even as we speak because researchers have created something called golden rice, where they have taken genes out of all things the daffodil flower, which has vitamin A in it, and they've inserted those genes into the rice. So now when people eat rice, they get the vitamin A they need. Maybe not all they need, but there are going to be other ways of getting the vitamin A as well. Moreover, these same researchers took this rice, which has iron in it, but it's not bioavailable. In other words, our bodies can't break it down and use it. They added another gene to make that iron in the rice bioavailable. So they actually did more to the rice, but the point is made that they have now taken with one staple crop. They've taken it, it had two great malnutrition problems, vitamin A and iron, and they have changed that through biotechnology, and it's already been done. This is not the work of the future. This is the work of the here and now.
Washington Post reporting this morning from a new United Nations report on hunger in America and around the world, saying it is increasing across the globe. The number of hungry people in the world increasing during the last half of the 1990s by 18 million worldwide to a total of 842 million people, reversing a steady drop over the past 3 decades, according to a new study by a UN agency. More than 1 in 7 people in the world endure chronic hunger, which is measured by a daily intake of less than 1,700 calories and a lack of access to safe and nutritious food. The vast majority, about 798 million, live in poor developing countries. About 10 million reside in the world's wealthiest industrialized nations. Next call is from Oakland, California. Good morning.
Yeah, good morning. I'm reminded of an article I read in Mother Jones a couple years ago regarding genetically modified salmon in British Columbia. And the article mentions that if one of those modified salmons jumps out of the fish farm in Canada, it can contaminate the entire natural species of salmon in the Pacific Northwest. Now, how are you going to explain that to the Native Americans?
Well, the first thing I'd explain is that anything you read in Mother Jones is going to be anti-biotechnology. That's their viewpoint, and they're never going to stray from it, no matter how many lives it will save. Mother Jones isn't concerned about the starving countries in Africa. It's concerned about its American readership. As far as this particular salmon goes, these salmon, first of all, are sterilized. They cannot breed. Second of all, they are held in controlled pens where theoretically, yes, one could escape. Hey, we've all seen Jurassic Park after all, but this is another protection. Finally, these salmon really are, for the most part, inferior as far as survival. The only trait they have that makes them superior is that they grow to market size about 3 times faster than an ordinary salmon. They don't actually grow bigger ultimately, they just get to full size somewhat larger. That means that they can be brought to market more quickly, they can be brought to market more cheaply, and ultimately the same techniques can be used not just in salmon, which is pretty much a first world type fish, but it can be used in fish throughout the world to feed the starving millions of people that we just heard about. And of course, fish is an extremely wonderful high protein food.
A related email from this viewer who says, quite some time ago, National Public Radio talked about the problem of the same antibiotics being used in livestock as is administered to people. The problem here is that when people eat enough of this, they develop a tolerance for or even an immunity to that said antibiotic. This then creates problems in treating people for medical conditions for which a shared antibiotic is the treatment. Correct or not?
Well, the jury's actually still out on that, but insofar as it has nothing really to do with biotechnology, I'd really rather not go into it.
Next call is from Trenton, Florida. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I just wanted to preface this that I'm all for biotechnology advances, but I just had a couple small questions. I don't know how to really word it all together, but I wondered, with all the money that's poured into research, do you think we get the right bang for the buck, as it were? And is it getting to be too costly to where we can't afford the products that we're developing?
That's a really good question, because some of these new biotech drugs, while they are miraculous, there's really no other word for it. In that sense, of course, I don't mean a gift from God, but I mean something that's just an absolute leap beyond anything we've had before. We're getting drugs that treat diseases that literally all a doctor before could do was give you an aspirin and say, I sympathize with you. We're getting these drugs, but some of them are extremely expensive to make. A pill can literally cost just a few cents to make if it's combinatorial chemistry. Even though they might sell it for $3, it costs 3 cents to make. Some of these biotech drugs actually, for a month's supply, costs several $1,000s to make for that month's supply. But the biotech industry is working on making these in much cheaper factories, if you will. The current factories are, and I've discussed this earlier, splicing a gene into bacteria and growing them in bacteria, or splicing them into mammalian cells, usually from hamsters, or putting them in yeast. These are all fairly expensive techniques. But already one company now is splicing proteins into corn. How much does it cost to grow this special corn? About what it costs to grow sweet corn. They're also working at splicing these same genes into all sorts of other crops, those with large amounts of protein in them naturally, because we're talking protein drugs here. They're looking at splicing them into milk, in which you wouldn't actually drink the milk, but the proteins would be extracted from the milk, again, at perhaps pennies per dose. And then finally, we're working on putting these proteins into eggs, where one chicken lays, on average, about an egg a day that is absolutely packed with protein. One chicken, perhaps, in half a year, could supply all of the biotech medicine needed for all the sufferers of a single disease on planet Earth. So ultimately, while some of these drugs are horribly expensive, we're going to make them to a point where they're incredibly cheap.
If you want to get more information on the concepts behind the book, you can log on to bioevolution.org or else frumento.com after our guest, Michael Frumento. Both of these websites, by the way, are available by simply linking on to cspan.org. This email from Sean in Kentucky wants to know, Mr. Frumento, if you could detail wetware, a sci-fi concept involving technology adapted to biology, such as modifying eyesight, strength, etc.
Well, a lot of these things are actually not being done through biotechnology at all, and I think that's really reassuring. Usually when you hear of these really fanciful sorts of things, such as super soldiers or things like this, I explain to people, you're not going to get that through biotechnology, because all biotechnology really involves is moving genes around, or as I said, maybe designing a drug to interact with the genome. And so, for example, maybe you can take a gene from a naturally very strong person and get that into an embryo or into the germline of somebody who would naturally be weak, and you'll get a somewhat stronger person. But that's all you're going to get. If you really want, say, a super soldier or a $6 million man, you're going to have to do it exactly the way they did it with the $6 million man. You're going to have to go the bionics route. And that truly will give you, things such as we see in the Terminator movies. But that's not biotech. That's bionics.
Back to your calls. New Orleans, good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. First of all, I'd like to say your method of using emails for stating good points is excellent, and you should do more of that. That's a great new idea. For the guest, I want to ask a question about human growth hormone, which is something in the health food circles and on infomercials now. Is there any legitimacy to that at all whatsoever?
Well, human growth hormone is, in fact, all biotech in this country. And the reason is they originally extracted it from the pituitary glands of human cadavers. And it was, in fact, a wonderful drug because, for example, it allowed people who are doomed to be dwarfs, little children doomed to be dwarfs, to grow to be more or less normal size. It's also had applications in other therapeutic areas, such as AIDS. But then it was discovered that there was something horrible coming out of this cadaverous human growth hormone, Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease. The disease, it's like mad cow syndrome, but it's natural. It turns your brain into Swiss cheese, and it was starting to kill people. But right at that time, when they discovered that, the biotech industry came up with gene-spliced, recombinant human growth hormone, and so now all the human growth hormone in the United States is 100% safe. So I'm glad you brought up that point. It shows what biotech is doing for us. Now, but that wasn't exactly your question. Your question is, I think, as I understand it, is there potential for abuse? And it's really hard to say, because so often something that starts out as purely therapeutic can start to be used for something that is extra therapeutic. Steroids originally were purely therapeutic, and for the most part they still are. Steroids are helping to keep a lot of AIDS victims alive. I've used steroids when I've had, say, a shoulder pull to help me out there. But steroids, as we know, are also being abused in athletics. Human growth hormone was originally used to treat dwarfism. Now some parents are trying to use it to turn a child who would ordinarily grow to be maybe 5'10", 5'11", and try to get a kid who might be 6'3", 6'5", and a lot of people think that's wrong, but I have mixed feelings about it myself, but you really can't draw bright lines like that. I'm afraid it's going to happen.
Crawford, Colorado, good morning.
Good morning. I would like to comment on the stem cell research, embryonic. I was recently blessed with a granddaughter. They took the blood from the umbilical cord and froze it. And it's my understanding that this, down the road, when they allow new stem cell research, it might be used to help my son who's a quadriplegic. Also, I would like you to comment on the European Union just approving funding for stem cell research.
The gentleman actually has it backwards. Although we use the term adult stem cell to differentiate from embryonic stem cells, the term adult stem cell is a bit of a misnomer. It includes the stem cells from umbilical cords and from placentas, which obviously are not adults. But these are not from embryonic cells. That's the point. Umbilical cord cells are already being used therapeutically. This is not a thing of the future. using them to treat diseases such as leukemia or spinal cord problems or this or that, that is something of the future. The near future, mind you, because it is in advanced testing. So he actually made my point for me. We don't need the embryonics. The adult stem cells, including those pulled from non-adults, will in fact do the trick for us.
Let me follow up on the issue of stem cell, because Elias Zeroni, who's the head of the National Institutes of Health, was interviewed by the Associated Press yesterday. And in essence, he was asked about the lines that the president, the stem cell lines that the president authorized in the initial research. And he is saying that if he feels that these cell lines are stunting research, he would be the first to go to the president to say they need more in order to do a thorough investigative look into the role that stem cell can play in the future. Can you explain or elaborate what he would need?
Well, first of all, unfortunately, nobody knows exactly how many embryonic stem cell lines there are out there. They're still investigating because they're literally all over the world. We don't know exactly, for example, what China has, but we know that China is very far along in experimenting in this area. China is not the most open country in the world, as we know. Mm-hmm. It also needs to be pointed out that you don't need any fixed number of embryonic stem cell lines, assuming you feel a need to have embryonic stem cells at all, which I don't. So we don't necessarily need the 62 that the president was originally told we have. We really, theoretically, could get by with a single good embryonic stem cell line, assuming, again, we even need embryonic stem cells.
Sturbridge, Massachusetts, good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'm listening to you on the Sirius satellite radio.
We're welcome. We're glad to have you.
Yes, it's a wonderful service. Sir, I got a feeling you're really actually a lobbyist for Monsanto. First of all, one, the main thing that has saved the small farmer in this country has been organic food. The Europeans do not want our alternative food, won't even buy this stuff. And finally, sir, the biggest threat to mankind in the next 100 years is overpopulation, in particularly in the industrialized area, mainly America. We are 3% of the world population. We use more than 25% of all the resources on Earth. Our problem is not saving people in an industrialized world. Our problem is trying to save the environment.
Caller, what's your background on this issue?
I've just read a lot about it. There's a population connection. Several organizations is trying to make this country, unfortunately, realize that the overpopulation problem in the area that you live in, there's been a book written talking about the problems in the greater Washington area because you're running out of land, you're running out of farmland to build houses on, and the road situation and the what it's doing to smog and all these other areas. It's population problem, which we're not dealing with.
Thank you for the comment, and keep listening to us on satellite radio services. Michael Fumento.
Sir, you have a right to your opinions. It just so happens your opinions are completely wrong. To extrapolate from what I too perceive as something of an overcrowding problem in the D.C. area to the world or to the United States, it just doesn't work. You have to use statistics. And the statistics from the United Nations show that the world's population is set to peak out at about 2050 at about 9 billion people. We've already got 6.3 billion, so we're not going to grow a whole lot before we peak. Guess what happens after 2050? The world's population starts to go into decline. So overpopulation simply is not the great problem we've been told, but to the extent that we need more food, and we're going to need more food for those 2.7 billion people, biotech can easily provide it. In fact, we've got other ways of providing it as well. You're talking about building houses on farmland. The reason we're able to do that is because every year in this country, we need less and less farmland. Why? Because of things like biotech, but other techniques as well. We keep growing more and more crops on the same amount of land. We need less farmland. Somebody might as well use it. The houses are using it.
Encounter Books is the publisher of Bioevolution, How Biotechnology is Changing Our World. Our guest is Michael Fumento. Our next call is New York City.
Can you explain how it works between business and politics that prevents biotech engineered foods from being labeled, thus preventing consumers from having a choice?
It's not so much politicians, it's the FDA, which has decided that food does not need to be labeled in this country as biotech. And the reason is quite simple. The FDA says, look, we can only put so much on a label. Now, mind you, in a lot of countries, they don't use food labels at all. We have actually a fairly large one. Depending on the size of your package, the label may be half the package already. But the FDA says, look, what goes on a label is what the consumer really needs to know for the consumer's health. There's no room for extraneous stuff. And so, for example, there are people who would like it to be on the label whether this food was hand-picked or machine-picked. The FDA says, no, it doesn't affect the food. It doesn't go on the label. There are people who want on the label whether this potato was grown in Idaho or somewhere else. The FDA says, no, it doesn't affect the food, whether it was grown in Idaho or somewhere else. Likewise, the FDA says organic food has gone through a much more rigorous process of approval than non-organic food. Again, it is approved biotech food has to be approved by the FDA, the EPA, and the USDA before it makes it onto the market. Organic food, on the other hand, that we're told is so very safe, does not necessarily need approval from anybody. You make a new organic food through the old crossbreeding methods, and you can bring it right onto the market, and if it makes people sick, it makes people sick. But hey, that's the way the system is.
This email from a viewer in Colorado. Would you care to comment on the political issue of environmentalists who so vigorously oppose measures such as those you have written about that would save many human lives, especially in the third world? For example, there are people refusing to allow genetically modified wheat to go to Africa where it is desperately needed. Is this viewer accurate?
It's actually genetically modified corn, but the point is the same. What has happened is last year, Africa was severely threatened by out-and-out starvation. Now, mind you, Africa continues to have a severe malnutrition problem. But they were threatened with out-and-out starvation, with literally hundreds of thousands of deaths. The United States sent over biotech corn. It had one gene put into it that made it slightly different from the corn that these Africans have always been eating. It is exactly the same corn that has been used in the United States, grown in the United States and eaten here since 1996. So we were not using Africans as guinea pigs, as was claimed. We were giving them the food that we were eating, but we had extra supplies, and we were trying to be generous and help. Along come the green groups, and they say, no go, this is biotech. We can't have biotech food in Africa. And if that means literally millions of people starving to death, so be it. Originally the African governments wanted the food, and then they said, oh, no, we have to keep it in the warehouses because someday we might want to export to Europe. We don't yet, but we might want to. And if we do, and any of this corn gets out, it could get in with our non-biotech corn, and Europe will refuse to import any of our food. Now, what was the action of the starving African people? God bless them. They broke into the warehouses, and they took the corn, and they fed their families anyway.
Next call, Surrey, Virginia, for Michael Frumento. Good morning.
Good morning. I had kind of a dual-purpose question. When they cloned first they genetically spliced a gene into a cow that produced milk that had a drug in it that was good for cystic fibrosis. I can't think of the name of the drug. Then they cloned the cow because they realized that if they tried to breed her back to get offspring, it would be just a certain number. By cloning, they could get it. This way, you could get a lot of cows that would produce or be able to give the milk with this certain drug in it that was good for cystic fibrosis. I went to one of the universities, spoke with the department chief of dairy science. They asked him about this, thinking that maybe it would be a good way to help a lot of industries, the drug industry, the dairy farmers, clone a lot of cows, and a certain farmer could produce milk for this. They said they weren't interested and threw up their hands. And I think it's because of artificial insemination, because this ruined the dairy breeding end of it. I had been superintendent of dairy cattle at the fair, and I had one man to tell me he just came to the fair for his children. He said previous years before artificial insemination, he'd been able to sell 20 calves. This ended it. I guess my question is, why is there so much resistance? I noticed in Europe.
Resistance towards?
Any improvement.
Okay, thank you.
Well, first, it's important to point out that artificial insemination is really an old technology. It's not biotechnology, and that the entire cattle industry now relies on artificial insemination. They extract the semen from the bull, and they use that to impregnate essentially all the cows. Some cows, I guess, still go the old-fashioned means, not biotech. The rest of what you talk about is biotech. Many types of animals are, in fact, being gene spliced. They're putting in a gene so that in their milk they will produce a therapeutic protein. For example, the original cloned animal, Dolly the sheep, was not cloned so that some company in Scotland could say, hey, we cloned the first mammal, look at us. Dolly was cloned because she was to carry in her milk a gene so that her milk could be extracted and used to create human clotting factor. But this milk can be used for any number of other diseases, such as the one you named, cystic fibrosis, which is a horrible disease. But you name it. Basically, any protein, therapeutic protein we want, can theoretically be produced in the milk of cows, sheep, goats, pigs. It's already being done, in fact. It's just not, none of it's yet FDA approved. So this is a wonderful technology, and it is being resisted, really not so much. In this area, Greenpeace knows to keep its mouth shut, because this is a technology that's going to aid the first world, and Greenpeace is a little bit more shy about that. They're willing to let people die by the millions in the third world. They're a little bit more hesitant to do so in the first world. That said, you still see a bit of resistance here because you hear things tossed around that just don't make any sense. They sound good, like, oh, you're playing God because you're cloning or because you're inserting this single human gene or the single gene into an animal. No. Okay, fine. If you want to say that it is unnatural that we stop people from dying from horrible diseases like cystic fibrosis, I'm all for you. Biotech is unnatural. But that's as far as I'll go.
Montera, California. Thanks for waiting.
Oh, sure. Thanks for letting me on. I do have a couple questions. One caller previously made reference to Monsanto, and I am curious if your speaker has any financial relationship with Monsanto, if he receives any support, or from other similar firms. But that's not my main question.
We'll answer that and then come back to your next point.
Okay.
Any connection?
Monsanto is, in fact, a big supporter of mine in the sense of they have bought up some of the books, as have a lot of different companies, because the book does say good things about Monsanto. So it makes perfect sense that they would do that.
Well, then, at what point are you a scientist searching for truth, and at what point are you a salesman or a pitchman for Monsanto and their products? Because that's where my question is. My main concern is the idea of Monsanto or any other corporation owning a patent on genes. you mentioned with the golden rice, for instance. The people in these third world countries have grown rice for centuries and centuries and centuries, and nobody owns the patent on it. If they want to grow rice or they want to experiment with rice, they can do it on their own, and they don't have any corporate masters they have to pay for. If Monsanto starts putting out golden rice, or they use other products where they have one generation, where they have sterile products, so people have to buy the seeds every year from Monsanto. Or similarly, where Monsanto has their Roundup Ready products, where they sell seeds that will grow into plants that are able to accept Roundup, one of Monsanto's pesticides, and which will then make the farmers dependent on those kind of seeds and dependent on using that pesticide. And so I think it establishes a dependence that really doesn't free the third world up from hunger, but in fact makes them taking products that were their own and making them growing products that belong to a different corporation on their own land.
Actually, your argument backfires on you. You talk about products of their own. I talked about a product of their own. It's called plain old white rice that has been a staple crop throughout much of the third world for thousands and thousands of years. I talked about how it contained no vitamin A, no usable iron, and that millions of people died and went blind because of this. I talked about how a research team using gene transfer technology was able to create golden rice that solved that problem for these people. But, and now this is the little tiny point on which you're right, at that point the research team ran into a problem. There were literally hundreds of patents out there that theoretically could have prevented golden rice from going past the development stage. And some were, in fact, owned by Monsanto. What did Monsanto do? It donated the patents. In fact, every single patent of these hundreds that were needed by this research team were donated by these same companies, the Sygentas, the Bayer crop scientists, the Dow agro scientists, all these multinationals that everybody loves to hate. All these patents were donated. These companies are also working on crops that can't possibly bring them a single penny, but they're doing it to help out in the third world. Now, you may say, well, they're only doing it because it's good publicity. Personally, I couldn't give a darn whether it's good publicity. I like seeing people's lives saved. I like seeing people not going blind. I like the idea that people in Africa may someday achieve the same standard of living that we're achieving. And if Monsanto wants to spend its hard-earned money, its stockholders' money in helping to develop these crops, bringing scientists over from Africa to study at Monsanto, and then go back to Africa. If Monsanto sees that it has some sort of gain in there, then God bless Monsanto, and I'm all for it, and they don't have to pay me to say something like that.
At 4:30 Eastern Time, 1:30 for those of you on the West Coast, a discussion that took place at Boston University on the topic of human cloning, part of our afternoon schedule here on C-SPAN. Next is a call from Vista, California. Good morning.
Good morning. I was very glad to hear Mr. Fomento explain that golden rice situation, because I had heard about that as well. I'm so glad that Monsanto gave out the patents and allowed that to happen, and I just hope that the golden rice can get quickly into the third world. And I do have one concern about a Monsanto product, and that is that Roundup Ready plant. I used to live in the San Joaquin Valley, with pesticides and all the rest, and I'm generally a great supporter of biotech. But when it comes to the herbicide-resistant plants, I've seen the way my farmer friends used herbicides, and if they could use more to kill weeds, they would. And if they have a plant that's resistant to it, what I'm afraid is that that they'll overuse the Roundup, these crops that in the past would have died before they could have come to our table would instead be saturated with the Roundup material and with these other herbicides that the plants are now resistant to, but the weeds aren't.
Thanks for the comment, caller. With about a minute left, we'll take one more from Houston, Texas. Good morning.
Thank you very much. Howdy, Steve, and happy Turkey Day. Three things really quickly. Number one, this is one of many things that's going on. If we're going to have a shortage of anything, isn't it going to be of scientists? Number two, how important is it for us to preserve old species, old seeds? I know you aren't going to answer all these. Number three, and this is way down the line, way out there, but if anybody's concerned about limits to growth, how many square miles are there on the moon? How many are there on Mars? And agricultural concerns of cross-contamination, greenhouses on the moon, that'll eliminate that problem.
There's a lot there. Can you summarize quickly?
No, we don't need greenhouses on the moon. We can do everything we want right here on Earth. As I said, some of these technologies, here's one. Again, we're not talking out in the future. This year, this latest crop year in Africa, farmers found that using the same type of cotton that's been grown here for several years, that it has an insect-resistant gene built into it, that this so-called BT cotton grown in Africa has doubled or more than doubled their yields of cotton on their farms. And there's no reason that they cannot get, again, doublings of yields with other biotech crops as well. Well, we don't even need doublings in order to ultimately feed the future of the world.
The book is called Bioevolution: How the Technology is Changing Our World. Michael Fumento is the author, also associated with the Hudson Institute. Thanks for joining us on this Thanksgiving morning.
My pleasure. Thank you.